Welcome. In 1928, one handshake changed the balance of power in America's underworld. A rising Harlem enforcer named Bumpy Johnson made a deal with the most feared gangster of the era, Al Capone, and overnight he became untouchable. This isn't rumor or movie myth. It's built from court records, police reports, first-hand accounts that took serious time to uncover. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If you appreciate stories backed by real, verified history, subscribe now. It helps keep this kind of deep, fact-based work coming. In 1928, Harlem was more than a cultural capital. It was one of the most profitable and volatile territories in the American underworld. Prohibition had turned alcohol into liquid gold, and Harlem's dense population, nightlife, and political corruption made it a prime battleground for criminal control. Speakeasies, gambling houses, and numbers rackets operated openly, often protected by bribed police and politicians. Whoever controlled Harlem controlled millions of dollars in illegal revenue. At the time, Harlem's criminal world was deeply divided along racial lines. White mobs from downtown Manhattan and beyond viewed Harlem as an open market rather than sovereign territory. Black operators ran local rackets, but were frequently forced to pay tribute to white gangs who supplied alcohol or muscle. This imbalance created constant tension as Harlem's homegrown figures sought autonomy while outside syndicates pushed to dominate. Schultz was the most aggressive of these outside forces. Backed by ruthless enforcers and a steady supply of bootleg liquor, Schultz aimed to seize full control of Harlem's numbers racket, a gambling system deeply rooted in the black community. His methods were violent and unapologetic, relying on intimidation, beatings, and murders to force compliance. By 1928, his presence had turned Harlem into a pressure cooker. Law enforcement offered little relief. Police corruption was rampant, and arrests were selective at best. Raids often targeted small, time black operators while leaving larger white syndicates untouched. This uneven enforcement not only fueled resentment, but also pushed Harlem's leaders to seek protection outside traditional legal channels. Survival depended less on innocence and more on alliances. Despite the chaos, Harlem maintained its own internal order. Street bosses, community figures, and political fixers quietly negotiated boundaries to keep violence from spilling into everyday life. Reputation mattered. Violence without purpose was bad for business, and those who couldn't control their crews didn't last long. Power in Harlem required discipline as much as brutality. This unstable balance created opportunity for men willing to think strategically rather than emotionally. The streets were crowded with soldiers, but true leadership was rare. Harlem needed someone who understood both the neighborhood and the broader criminal system forming across America, someone who could speak the language of local loyalty and national power. It was within this dangerous, fragmented environment that Bumpy Johnson began to rise. Harlem in 1928 wasn't just a backdrop to his story. It was the crucible that made his choices necessary. To survive and eventually dominate, Johnson would need protection that Harlem alone could not provide, setting the stage for a deal that would change everything. Before his name carried fear and respect across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was already a known presence on the streets, but not yet untouchable. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, he earned the nickname Bumpy from a noticeable lump on his head. By the late 1920s, he was in his early 20s, sharp-minded, physically imposing, and known for a calm confidence that set him apart from reckless street soldiers. Bumpy was not a typical gangster. While many of his peers relied solely on violence, he valued intelligence, strategy, and reputation. He was an avid reader with a particular interest in history and philosophy, a rare trait in the underworld of the time. This combination of intellect and intimidation made people underestimate him at their own risk. Early on, Bumpy aligned himself with Stephanie St. Clair, the powerful and politically connected Queen of Harlem. She ran much of Harlem's numbers racket and recognized Bumpy's potential quickly. Under her guidance, he learned how money, politics, and crime intersected, and how influence could be more powerful than bullets. She trusted him with sensitive tasks, including enforcement and negotiations. Bumpy's role was not just muscle. He became a protector of Harlem's interests. When Dutch Schultz's men began encroaching on black run operations, Bumpy was often the one sent to push back. His confrontations with Schultz's enforcers earned him a reputation for fearlessness and for refusing to be intimidated by white mobsters who expected submission. However, this defiance came at a cost. Bumpy was frequently arrested, harassed by police, and targeted by rival gangs. Unlike bigger syndicate figures, he had no national protection, no political shield outside Harlem, and no powerful allies beyond St. Clair's network. Every move he made carried the risk of jail or death. What made Bumpy dangerous wasn't just his willingness to fight. It was his understanding that Harlem's future couldn't be secured through street wars alone. He saw the limits of local power in a system increasingly controlled by national crime syndicates. Harlem needed leverage, just resistance. By 1928, Bumpy Johnson stood at a crossroads. He was respected, feared, and rising, but still vulnerable. Without broader protection, his days were numbered. That vulnerability is what made the idea of a deal, not a war, the most powerful weapon he could choose. By 1928, Al Capone was no longer just a Chicago crime boss. He was the most powerful and recognizable figure in American organized crime. His influence stretched far beyond Illinois, reaching into New York, Detroit, Cleveland, and key supply routes across the country. Through bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering, Capone controlled a criminal empire worth tens of millions of dollars a year. What set Capone apart was his control of alcohol distribution during Prohibition. While many gangs fought over territory, Capone dominated production and transportation. Breweries, warehouses, trucking lines, and corrupt officials all answered to him in one way or another. This gave him leverage over other criminal organizations that depended on a steady flow of liquor to survive. Capone also understood the value of alliances over constant warfare. Rather than expanding through endless violence, he preferred partnerships that increased profit while reducing risk. He negotiated with East Coast mobs, paid off politicians, and used intermediaries to manage conflicts before they turned into bloodshed. This approach helped stabilize his empire and expand it quietly. Equally important was Capone's reputation for extreme retaliation. While he avoided unnecessary violence, crossing him came with severe consequences. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was still a year away. By 1928, his willingness to eliminate threats was already well known. This reputation alone often prevented challenges before they began. Capone's power also reached into law enforcement and the courts. Judges, police chiefs, and politicians were regularly bribed or intimidated. Arrests rarely stuck, witnesses disappeared, and cases collapsed. This legal insulation made him nearly untouchable for years, reinforcing the idea that Capone operated above the law. On the national stage, Capone was seen as an informal authority within the criminal world. Smaller gangs and local bosses understood that aligning with him offered protection, access to resources, and legitimacy. His name carried weight, functioning almost like a criminal passport across city lines. It was this national reach that made Capone valuable to someone like Bumpy Johnson. Aligning with a local Harlem figure alone meant little, but connecting Harlem's operations to Capone's empire created protection that no local rival could challenge. Capone wasn't just powerful, he was a shield, and in 1928, that shield was priceless. The meeting that would alter Bumpy Johnson's fate was not dramatic in the way movies portray criminal summits. There was no public spectacle, no visible show of force. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, and carefully arranged through intermediaries who understood the risks on both sides. In 1928, meetings like this were about trust, discretion, and mutual benefit, not bravado. Bumpy Johnson did not approach Al Capone directly. The introduction moved through trusted criminal channels, likely involving East Coast mob figures who already had business ties to Capone's organization. These middlemen ensured that neither side was walking into a trap. For Capone, any meeting carried the risk of law enforcement attention or betrayal. For Bumpy, it could mean death if misread. When the two sides finally sat down, the conversation was about business, not race or pride. Capone was known for respecting usefulness over background, and Bumpy understood the importance of presenting Harlem as an asset rather than a liability. The discussion focused on liquor distribution, protection of numbers operations, and stabilizing territory that had become dangerously volatile. Bumpy made it clear that Harlem was under siege from Dutch Schultz and other aggressive outsiders whose violence threatened profits for everyone involved. Constant warfare disrupted supply lines, attracted police scrutiny, and damaged long-term earning potential. What Bumpy offered was order, controlled operations in exchange for protection and recognition. Capone saw the logic immediately. Harlem was a lucrative market, and Dutch Schultz was unpredictable. By backing Bumpy Johnson, Capone could weaken Schultz's influence while expanding his own reach into New York without direct confrontation. It was a strategic move that cost little but promised long-term gain. The agreement itself was likely simple in structure but powerful in implication. Capone's organization would supply liquor and extend protection, while Bumpy ensured Harlem remained stable and profitable. In return, Capone's name would stand behind Bumpy, an unspoken threat that no rival could ignore. When the meeting ended, nothing appeared to have changed on the surface, but in reality, the balance of power had shifted overnight. Bumpy Johnson walked out with something far more valuable than weapons or money. He walked out with national backing, and from that moment forward, He was no longer just a Harlem enforcer. The deal between Bumpy Johnson and Al Capone worked because it was mutually beneficial, not charitable. Neither man entered the agreement out of loyalty or friendship. This was pure strategy. Each side saw an opportunity to strengthen their position while minimizing risk, and in the criminal world of 1928, balance was rare and valuable. For Bumpy Johnson, the most immediate gain was protection. Capone's name carried national weight. Simply being associated with him changed how rivals, enforcers, and even police viewed Bumpy. Harlem gangsters who once tested him now hesitated. White mobs that previously ignored Harlem's autonomy suddenly thought twice before making a move. Capone's backing functioned like an invisible shield. Bumpy also gained access to reliable liquor supplies. Prohibition made alcohol the most profitable commodity in the underworld, and inconsistent supply meant weak control. With Capone's distribution network behind him, Harlem's speakeasies could operate smoothly. Profits stabilized. Internal disputes over territory decreased. Control replaced chaos. Just as important was legitimacy within the broader criminal ecosystem. Before the deal, Bumpy was a strong local figure with limited reach. Afterward, he was recognized as Harlem's official power broker. That recognition reduced the need for constant violence. When disputes arose, Bumpy could negotiate from a position of authority rather than force. For Capone, the benefits were equally strategic. Harlem represented a massive consumer market, and controlling it indirectly through Bumpy allowed Capone to expand east without drawing attention. There was no need for Chicago soldiers in New York streets. Bumpy handled enforcement locally while Capone collected profit quietly. Capone also weakened Dutch Schultz without firing a shot. Schultz's aggressive expansion had made him a liability, attracting law enforcement scrutiny and destabilizing operations. By backing Bumpy, Capone undercut Schultz's influence in Harlem, isolating him and limiting his access to one of New York's most lucrative rackets. In the end, the deal wasn't about dominance. It was about efficiency. Bumpy gained protection, stability, and power, while Capone gained profit, influence, and reduced competition. It was a rare alignment where both sides walked away stronger, and that balance is exactly why the agreement held. Before the deal, Bumpy Johnson's power ended at Harlem's borders. Outside the neighborhood, he was just another local enforcer, vulnerable to arrest, ambush, or disappearance. In the late 1920s, crossing city lines without protection was dangerous. Territory mattered. Outsiders rarely survived long. The agreement with Al Capone changed that reality instantly. Capone's influence functioned like an unofficial national passport in the criminal world. His alliances with Midwestern and East Coast syndicates meant that anyone operating under his protection was recognized and, more importantly, respected. Word traveled quickly through underworld channels, and Bumpy's name became linked to Capone's almost overnight. This protection wasn't written or publicly declared. It was understood. If someone targeted Bumpy, they weren't just starting a local dispute, they were challenging Capone's authority. That implication alone deterred attacks. Even violent rivals knew the cost of crossing Capone far outweighed any potential gain. Law enforcement also adjusted their approach. While Bumpy was still arrested, charges often failed to stick. Witnesses disappeared. Cases lost momentum and pressure eased. Capone's ability to influence legal outcomes across jurisdictions made Bumpy a far less attractive target for aggressive prosecution. The deal also allowed Bumpy to travel and negotiate more freely. Meetings with suppliers, fixers, and other crime figures no longer required secrecy or fear of betrayal. His presence was recognized and his safety assumed. In a world built on reputation, that recognition was a powerful currency. This cross-city protection strengthened Harlem's autonomy. Outside gangs no longer viewed the neighborhood as open territory. Any move required negotiation rather than invasion. Harlem's operations stabilized, violence decreased, and profits increased, all without Capone ever needing to appear in New York. By extending protection beyond geography, the deal transformed Bumpy Johnson from a neighborhood power into a nationally connected figure. He was no longer confined by streets or city limits. In the underworld of 1928, that kind of mobility meant survival and dominance. The deal between Bumpy Johnson and Al Capone immediately altered the balance of power for Dutch Schultz, who had been aggressively pushing into Harlem. Schultz thrived on intimidation and violence, believing force alone could secure control of the numbers racket. But once Capone's backing entered the picture, Harlem was no longer an isolated prize. It became protected territory. Schultz understood exactly what Capone's involvement meant. A conflict with Bumpy was no longer a street-level war. It was a potential national dispute. Schultz was ruthless, but he was also pragmatic. He knew that challenging Capone could bring consequences far beyond Harlem, threatening his supply lines, alliances, and survival. As a result, Schultz's expansion stalled. His enforcers pulled back, confrontations decreased, and intimidation tactics lost effectiveness. The fear that once worked on local operators no longer carried the same weight. Harlem figures who had previously complied out of fear now stood firm, knowing Bumpy had powerful backing. Other rivals took notice as well. Smaller gangs and independent operators quickly adjusted their behavior. Some sought alliances with Bumpy, others avoided Harlem entirely. The message was clear: Harlem was no longer open for takeover. Power had consolidated, and challenges would be costly. This shift also reduced internal violence. Without constant outside pressure, Bumpy could focus on controlling disputes within Harlem rather than fighting invading forces. Order replaced chaos. Stability became more profitable than warfare. Rivals realized that negotiation now carried more value than aggression. For Schultz, the consequences went beyond Harlem. Being blocked by Capone's influence limited his growth and increased tensions with other syndicates. His reputation as an unstoppable force began to crack, and that perception shift would later contribute to his isolation within the criminal world. In the end, the deal didn't just protect Bumpy Johnson, it reshaped rival behavior across New York. Dutch Schultz and others learned that brute force had limits when faced with national power. Harlem's streets had spoken, and the answer was no longer violence, it was authority. Before the deal, Bumpy Johnson was a frequent target for law enforcement. He was well known to police, regularly stopped, arrested, and questioned. As a visible Harlem enforcer, he was considered expendable, easy to pressure and easy to replace. But once Capone's influence entered the equation, The way authorities treated Bumpy quietly began to change. Al Capone's power over law enforcement was not official, but it was effective. Through bribes, political connections, and intimidation, Capone ensured that cases involving his interests often collapsed before reaching trial. Judges delayed proceedings, evidence went missing, and witnesses became uncooperative. This same protective shadow extended to those operating under his umbrella. Arrests didn't stop, outcomes did. Charges against Bumpy were frequently reduced or dismissed. Cases stalled without explanation. Prosecutors, aware of the larger forces involved, prioritized easier targets. Pursuing Bumpy suddenly meant risking interference, pressure from above, or career damage. Police on the street adapted as well. Officers understood which names carried consequences. Harassment decreased, surveillance loosened, and raids became less frequent. Bumpy was no longer treated as a small-time criminal, but as someone connected to powerful interests beyond Harlem. This shift frustrated reform-minded officials who lacked the resources to challenge entrenched corruption. The system favored stability over justice, and removing Bumpy threatened to disrupt a criminal balance that, paradoxically, reduced violence. In the eyes of some officials, containment was preferable to confrontation. The public never saw this change directly. There were no announcements or official protections, only patterns. Bumpy remained free while others disappeared into prison. Over time, this reinforced his reputation as untouchable, not just on the streets, but within the legal system. Limiting law enforcement's ability to act, the deal solidified Bumpy Johnson's position. Power in the underworld wasn't just about fear, it was about immunity. And by 1928, Bumpy had gained something far more dangerous than a weapon: legal invisibility. The deal with Al Capone did more than protect Bumpy Johnson. It fundamentally reshaped how power operated in Harlem. Before the agreement, authority was fragmented, constantly challenged by outside mobs and internal rivalries. Control shifted through violence, intimidation, and short-lived alliances. Stability was rare, and profits were unpredictable. With Capone's backing, Bumpy emerged as Harlem's central authority. He was no longer just enforcing power, he was organizing it. Independent operators now answered to a single figure rather than multiple competing bosses. This consolidation reduced chaos and created a clearer chain of command throughout the neighborhood's criminal economy. One of the most noticeable changes was the reduction in open violence. Turf wars declined as disputes were settled through negotiation rather than gunfire. Violence had become bad for business, and Bumpy enforced discipline with consistency. Those who caused unnecessary trouble were quickly removed, reinforcing order. Harlem's relationship with outside syndicates also changed. Instead of being exploited, Harlem now negotiated. Deals were structured, boundaries respected, and profits shared on clearer terms. Outside mobs recognized Harlem as a protected territory rather than an easy target, shifting the power dynamic permanently. Local political influence grew alongside criminal control. Money flowed more predictably, allowing bribes to be distributed strategically. This strengthened relationships with politicians, police officials, and community leaders, further insulating Harlem's operations from interference. Within the community, Bumpy's authority carried a complex reputation. While feared, He was also seen as a stabilizing force who kept violence from spilling into everyday life. Businesses operated with fewer disruptions, and residents experienced a quieter, if morally compromised, form of order. By reshaping Harlem's power structure, the deal transformed the neighborhood from contested ground into an organized stronghold. Authority was no longer temporary or fragile. It was centralized, protected, and enduring. Harlem had a ruler, and his position was secured by national power. After the deal with Al Capone, Bumpy Johnson's transformation was undeniable. He was no longer just a powerful Harlem figure. He had crossed into a different category altogether. On the streets, in rival circles, and even among police, his name carried a new meaning. He was someone you did not challenge lightly. This untouchable status wasn't built on constant violence. In fact, Bumpy rarely needed to prove his strength anymore. His reputation did the work for him. Knowledge that he operated under Capone's protection made threats unnecessary. Power had become implied rather than enforced. Rivals adjusted their behavior quickly. Former enemies avoided direct confrontation, while smaller operators sought his approval instead of testing his authority. Disputes were brought to him for resolution, settled in the streets. This shift confirmed that Bumpy had moved from enforcer to final decision maker. Law enforcement reinforced this perception. Arrests became less frequent, cases weaker, and surveillance lighter. Whether through corruption, political pressure, or fear of larger consequences, authorities treated Bumpy differently. His continued freedom became proof of his immunity. Bumpy also learned how to wield power with restraint. He understood that survival depended on balance. Too much aggression invited attention, too little invited challenge. His leadership style mixed intimidation with calculation, keeping Harlem stable while maintaining dominance. Beyond Harlem, Bumpy's reputation spread. He was recognized by national crime figures as the man who controlled one of New York's most valuable territories. His presence at negotiations carried weight, and his word was trusted because it was backed by force few dared to test. By the end of 1928, Bumpy Johnson had achieved what few ever did in the underworld security. He wasn't untouchable because he was invincible. He was untouchable because touching him came at a cost no one was willing to pay.